Welcome back to The Report with me, Yasmin Khatun. Today, Prime Minister David Cameron announced new legislation where police forces will record anti-Muslim hate crimes as a specific standalone crime, bringing these crimes in line with similar anti-Semitic attacks. It comes as the Home Office prepares to unveil new figures which are expected to show a rise in the number of hate crimes over the last year. Annisa Omar has this report.
The new legislation will provide police, prosecutors and local authorities with the necessary data on hate crimes to better protect and serve the Muslim communities of England and Wales. This law was announced today by Prime Minister David Cameron while he hosted the first meeting of the new Community Engagement Forum to discuss countering extremism. This forum brings together representatives from all faiths around the country to hear from those battling extremism in their communities. The PM also revealed new funding which will improve the security of faith establishments, including mosques. Speaking ahead of the meeting, Mr Cameron said, "I want to build a national coalition to challenge and speak out against extremists and the poison they peddle. I want British Muslims to know we will back them to stand against those who spread hate and to counter the narrative which says Muslims do not feel British." Home Secretary Theresa May said, "Hate crime has no place in Britain, and I am determined to make further progress to ensure we can eradicate this deplorable act. Working with police to provide a breakdown of religious-based hate crime data will help forces to build community trust, target their resources, and enable the public to hold them to account." The government said no figure has yet been decided for the extra funding to protect the faith establishments. However, it will discuss with members of the new forum. Today, the Home Office prepares to unveil new figures which are expected to show a rise in the number of hate crimes over the last year, continue to trend in 2013 to 14. In the aftermath of the murder of soldier Lee Rigby in London in May 2013, offences involving religious hatred rose by 45% and race hate crime by 4%. But the question now remains as to whether such proposals will make the Muslim community safer and establish a greater degree of trust for the government.
Joining us to discuss this, Imran Shah, political commentator, and Mohammed Ansar, political commentator, who's written and spoken intensively about Islamophobic attacks. Mohammed, can I come to you first? Isn't this law a bit overdue?
It certainly is overdue. I mean, this is something that we've been petitioning for, lobbying. Personally, I met with the Director of Public Prosecutions for the CPS some time ago, and some of the issues we discussed were the fact that race hate crimes had dropped, anti-Muslim hate crimes were spiking. However, CPSs around the country and police forces and constabularies were not prosecuting these crimes. They weren't even monitoring them. For some time, we've had race hate crimes and anti-Muslim hate crimes being thrown into the same pot as far as the figures and monitoring are concerned. So if you went up to any particular constabulary and asked them, do you have a problem with an anti-Muslim hate crime? They couldn't tell you. Now, I've met with police and crime commissioners, senior policing officials have even sent reports up to the College of Policing, and it's about time. This has been well overdue.
Mohammed, how will this law impact the work of the police and other community forces?
I think this is going to give greater degree of clarity which police forces have needed, and they've needed quite a firm steer. I mean, we're under the current regime, we're seeing police forces around the country merging, regionalising. They are, in austere times, there have been quite stringent cuts which have affected grassroots policing across the country. What that means is that police are being asked to do more, but they have less capacity to do so. As a result, they needed quite a strong steer from the Home Office about the figures that they do need to record. And before, they weren't tasked with recording and separating out and teasing out anti-Muslim hate crimes, but now they're being asked to do that, which is important. And it's also important that PCCs are going to be monitoring this.
So if it's easier to record and report, then it should theoretically make it easier to tackle, right?
Well, I think tackling it is one issue. I think the first thing we need to do is that they need to be prepared to do the tough thing, which is to find out, do we have a problem with anti-Muslim hate crime? Now, Muslims across the country will tell you we do. We've seen the rise of the far right across Europe. There's a report out from Demos today which talks about the level of discrimination that Muslims face in employment. So you're 75% more likely to be unemployed and discriminated at the point of even sending your CV in if you're a Muslim than if you're non-Muslim. Muslims are suffering discrimination, marginalisation and alienation. I've written about the fact that I think this is a Muslim civil rights crisis in the West. Now, at the first point, police forces need to be monitoring it. Next, we need to deal with it on parity with anti-Semitic attacks across the country. And then finally, CPSs This also comes down to places of employment. This also comes down to school governance. This also comes down to every facet of our society, where people need to start engaging, saying we really need to accept that we do have a problem. Denial isn't just a river. We need to look at this clearly, and then we need to start tackling it.
Okay, Imran, Shah, can I bring you into this discussion? Now, one of the reports that we saw was of an Islamophobic attack was a lady doused with alcohol. I mean, how common are these sorts of attacks?
These are very common now. I mean, last year there has been some constabularies that are actually recording Islamophobia, about 10 of them amongst the whole total. I mean, the year before we saw a rise of 64% across the whole of London, and it's a similar type of double figure, I think around 70% of the last year in London alone. So what will this legislation, this push for legislation to make it legal to record Islamophobia will give us a much fuller picture. But interesting, what it'll also do is build an evidence case of how hard it is to prosecute under existing law. So you're much more easier to prosecute someone under racial discrimination than you are under religious discrimination. And what will happen is that we'll build up a database, the police and general sort of monitoring hate crime groups will build up a picture, and we'll start to make the case, actually, the legislation is not fit to prosecute a lot of these crimes. So there is this is definitely a welcome call, but it's definitely not.
You're saying
enough.
we need more of this?
Yeah, we definitely need more of this, but what the signal should be sent out to the Muslim public that we definitely need to report every single instance of hate crime, no matter how small, because one, it gives us a fuller picture, but also it gives us an evidence base in which we can call for a legislative change to offer Muslims better protection under the law. But there is also another piece of the puzzle as well, if I may just mention this, is that a lot of the Islamophobia that's being regimented and institutionalized is from the counterterrorism legislation itself. So whilst a lot of Muslim activists, including myself and a lot of Muslim organizations, will welcome this call for reporting as a separate hate crime, we have to also understand that from the government perspective, they're actually creating a lot of Islamophobia from government policy itself. And that's something that we need to address as a nation and as British communities.
Mohammed, can I just ask you about that comment that Imran made about Islamophobia coming from the government itself?
I think it's very strong to say that Islamophobia is coming from the government. I think I've worked, and I do regularly meet and work with senior politicians and cabinet level ministers. I think we should be clear and to say, look, there are certain interests within our political class which clearly has an anti-Muslim agenda. I mean, there have been a series of reports out. One was from the University of Bath, led by Professor David Miller last year, which talked about how the Henry Jackson Society was connected with what they called the pro-Zionist or the neoconservative and the anti-Muslim or counter-jihadist network in the United States. Now, these are organizations that work at the heart of government. They're organizations which are well connected with senior political figures like Michael Gove, who we know has moved infamously from his Trojan horse activities on education and is now doing a similar sort of thing in the Ministry of Justice. And there are huge issues around whether Muslims, ethnic minorities, marginalized communities are going to be able to access justice. So it's all well and good saying, let's make sure we've got a level playing field. But the next question is going to be, can we access justice? So I think there are questions around certain interests in government. Interests, for example, we know that there have been very scathing criticisms, and I'm one of the biggest critics of the Prevent agenda and the Quilliam Foundation, having had involvement with them in the past and having been involved in these things. I think these things have morphed out of control. They've become Frankenstein's monster. And I think we now have a responsibility to look at this and say, this isn't what was intended originally. This isn't community-led, whether it's policing or whether community-led development. Muslims are not leading on these agendas. And actually, if we want to engage Muslims in the political processes, if we want to engage Muslims in the democratic processes, these sort of agendas need to be given to Muslim communities and credible voices within the Muslim communities. We have certain government-backed and sponsored organizations who are leading on anti-Muslim hate crimes, but these are ones primarily who are working with those looking to undermine Muslims, journalists, anti-theists, ex-Muslims. And I daren't taint them all with the same brush, but there are many within those communities who are desperately seeking to undermine Islam and desperately seeking to attack Muslims. And we need to start asking the questions about who is leading this conversation and who are these groups who are involved. And credible organizations like MEND, credible organizations like Kate, we need to empower them and support them and help them to get this work done.
Imran, Mohammed Ansar there mentioning prevent and some of the issues that it causes. As you mentioned, some of this may have been what you were speaking about and saying the government-led initiatives. What do you think of tackling Islamophobia in terms of this particular law that's come through? Will we see any change if it's easier to report and record? I asked this to Mohammed Ansar earlier. Will it be easier to tackle?
In terms of the actual on-the-ground Islamophobia, the actual hate crime, so the end product of the Islamophobia that's been whipped up by the likes of Michael Gove, the likes of the Daily Mail and sorts, that type of Islamophobia, it'll be much more easier to tackle, and there'll be training modules, there'll be the sort of equipment and whatever's necessary for the police to tackle this head on, as it is with anti-Semitism. That type of Islamophobia is definitely much more easier to tackle with this sort of legislation if it goes through. Now, but like I said, I mean, this is the symptom rather than the cause. When you look at racism, when you look at sexism, when you look at even homophobia and all these types of discrimination, it's all system down. It's all top down. It all roots from a system of power. And if those ideals, if essentially
the Prime Minister today did announce more money for faith establishments. Do you think that's putting an arm out there to try and help?
Well, it may be the case that that Theresa May, and I mean these are one of the things that essentially was proposed in their manifesto. So the Conservatives are sort of duly acting out their manifesto, and there were some concerns whether they'll even act on this, and it seems that they are. But the general sort of concern is that they have shut out the likes of MCB, they have shut out various different mainstream political organisations, and they've replaced them with Quillian Foundation, with HJS and all the other organisations that Mo Ansar just mentioned. And despite the sort of constant criticism from academics, from teachers, from unions, from policy think tanks that prevent is toxic, it's detrimental, even from the security service themselves, they've stuck with this ideologically driven type of counter-terrorism that doesn't have any evidence base at all. So you gotta, I mean, this is definitely welcome. It's not entirely bad news, but the message to the government from the Muslim communities, and especially from Muslim organisations and activists, is that this is good, but you've got to do a lot better than this if you're going to gain any credibility amongst the British Muslims.
Mohammed, before we have to wrap up the programme, of course, like Imran mentioned, we need a little bit more. We need maybe a lot more. But this must be welcomed, right? If we were saying that we weren't sure as to whether the Tory party would act upon its policy in saying that they would put this in place, we have seen it. They have done it. We have seen some laws pass through. This should be welcomed, right? Yeah,
absolutely. I think that's the most important thing. We do have to welcome it. I think also Muslims also need to stand up. We've got real principles around collectivism, around the idea that we are in these things together as Muslims with other minority groups across the country. And I think for far too long, we've looked towards our political leaders, we've looked towards social leaders and faith leaders and put our trust in their hands and said, you take the lead and we'll entrust this with you. I think the younger generations of Muslims who are coming up, well-educated, very well politically versed, those who want to be engaged in their communities, I think it's time that you take control in your own hands. You get involved in the democratic processes, you get involved with unions, you get involved with political parties and make your voice heard. I think these are crucial things. Sadly, I think for far too long, Muslim communities have been seen as a bit of a political punch bag and have been seen as a bit of a doormat. If somebody wanted to make a policy, as we saw Theresa May at the Conservative Party conference in Manchester last week, she wanted to put her leadership credentials out there on the table and did so by attacking migrants and Muslim communities in some of the most right-wing policy suggestions that we've heard for many a decade in this country. And I know that Theresa May doesn't fully believe in those views, but it's time that we started tackling the real causes of ideological extremism, which are rife in the media, rife in government, and also right in the corporate and public spheres. And I think once we start doing that, we can really begin to tackle the causes of anti-Muslim prejudice and hysteria in this country.
Mohammed, Ansar and Imran Shah, thank you both very much for joining us. I'm afraid that's it for this episode of The Report, but I want to thank all of my guests on today's programme and thank you at home for tuning in. You can keep up with us on Twitter by following @Islam Channel and @Islam Channel and using hashtag The Report. Now, lawmakers from South Korea's main opposition party had a protest against the government decision to monopolise the writings of history textbooks, a move that has sparked allegations that the government is seeking to turn the clock back to the authoritarian regime of the 1970s. We leave you with scenes from South Korean citizens signing the petition in the streets to overthrow the government's decision and conservative activist group members clashing with the opposition party leaders and policemen. Have a good evening.
20일 정도 가지고 있는데요. 그 20일간 우리가 많은 의견을 내서 실제 그 앞장서서 또 해주시면.
That's fine. When did you be going on?